I remember the weight of sleeplessness that night, how it settled into my bones like something permanent. It was past midnight when I finally gave up on the tangled sheets and the stubborn pull of consciousness that refused to let me rest. The dormitory hallway was empty, fluorescent lights humming their endless mechanical song, casting everything in that harsh, sterile glow that made even familiar spaces feel foreign. The concrete steps outside were cold against my jeans, but I welcomed the shock of it. The campus stretched out before me in the darkness, punctuated only by scattered street lamps that carved small circles of yellow light into the night. Somewhere nearby, a vending machine hummed its quiet song, the only other sound besides my own breathing and the distant whisper of wine through the trees that lined the walkways. I had always been comfortable with solitude, maybe too comfortable. It was easier than the mess of other people, their unpredictable needs and expectations. Easier than the risk of disappointing them, or worse, of them disappointing me. So I sat there, letting the night air clear the fog from my head, thinking about the engineering problem set I'd left half finished on my desk, about the shift I had at the campus gym tomorrow afternoon, about the careful architecture of a life that felt increasingly hollow. That's when I heard the soft pad of bare feet against concrete. I turned, expecting to see another insomniac wandering the paths, maybe someone heading back from a late study session or returning for whatever adventures filled other people's nights. Instead, I saw him, Jonah. I knew who he was, of course. Everyone on campus seemed to know Jonah in some capacity. He was the kind of person who drew attention without trying, who moved through conversations and social circles like water, never quite belonging to any single group, but somehow essential to all of them. He was holding a notebook against his chest, clutching it like it contained something precious or dangerous, maybe both. His feet were bare, pale against the dark pavement, and his hair caught the streetlight in a way that made him look younger than I knew he was. There was something about the way he moved, unhurried but purposeful, that made it seem like encountering me here was inevitable rather than chance. He sat down beside me without asking permission, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body, close enough that our shoulders almost touched. The space between us felt charged, electric with possibility and uncertainty. I waited for him to explain his presence, to offer some reason for this midnight appearance, but he simply settled beside me as if we had planned this meeting all along. We began to talk, and it was unlike any conversation I'd had in months, maybe years. Not the careful exchanges I was used to, the polite inquiries about classes and weather that filled most of my interactions with other people. Instead, we found ourselves in territory that felt both safe and dangerous, discussing the kind of sleeplessness that goes deeper than tired eyes, the way the stars seemed dimmed by the city's glow, the peculiar loneliness of being surrounded by thousands of other students yet feeling utterly isolated. Jonah's voice was quieter than I'd expected, more thoughtful. I'd seen him in classes, heard him contribute to discussions with insights that seemed to come from some deeper well of understanding, but this was different. This was intimate in a way that made my chest feel tight, like I was being let in on something secret and significant. He asked me about my major, about the engineering problems that kept me awake, but even those practical questions felt weighted with meaning when he asked them. There was a quality of attention in the way he listened, like every word mattered, like my answers were revealing something important about who I was beneath the careful surface I presented to the world. I found myself talking about things I rarely shared with anyone. The pressure I felt to have everything figured out, to follow the path I'd mapped for myself with such precision. The way my days felt scripted, measured out in assignments and obligations and phone calls home, where I assured my parents that everything was going according to plan. The growing sense that somewhere along the way, I'd forgotten what it felt like to want something for myself rather than because it made sense, because it fit the image of who I was supposed to be. Jonah listened without judgment, without trying to fix or advise. He simply absorbed my words like they were worth holding on to. When he spoke about his own life, it was in fragments that painted a picture of someone who lived more instinctively than I ever had. He talked about the stories he wrote, the way words sometimes came to him in the middle of the night, like visitors he had to welcome or risk losing forever. He mentioned professors who challenged him to think differently, friends who drifted in and out of his orbit, a father who never quite understood why anyone would choose to study literature when there were more practical paths available. The conversation meandered the way good conversations do, following threads of thought and association that led us deeper into territory that felt increasingly personal. I told him about the apartment I kept meticulously organized, how I decorated it with objects that looked right but meant nothing to me. He described the notebook he carried everywhere, filled with observations and fragments of conversations and moments that struck him as worth preserving. And then, as we sat there talking about the strange intimacy of sharing space with thousands of other people while feeling fundamentally alone, something shifted. The air between us seemed to thicken, charged with an energy I couldn't name but could definitely feel. It was like standing at the edge of something vast and unknown, knowing that one more step would change everything. That's when it happened. As if testing the air, as if conducting some kind of experiment, Jonah reached out and took my hand. The contact was electric, immediate, and undeniable. His fingers were warm, slightly calloused from whatever work he did with his hands, maybe from the notebook he was always writing in. The touch was gentle but deliberate, not accidental or casual, but purposeful in a way that made my breath catch in my throat. The world around us seemed to sharpen and recede all at once. The humming vending machine faded into background noise, the scattered streetlights became distant stars, and everything that had felt important just moments before. My carefully planned life, my methodical approach to everything, the safe distance I maintained from anything that might disrupt my sense of control, all of it became secondary to the simple fact of Jonah's hand in mine. I should have pulled away. Everything in my training, my careful cultivation of a life free from complications, told me to extract myself from whatever this was before it became something I couldn't manage. But I didn't move. I couldn't move. Instead, I sat there, feeling the warmth of his palm against mine, the slight pressure of his fingers, the way this simple gesture seemed to unlock something in me that I hadn't even realized was locked away. The silence stretched between us, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was full of possibility, heavy with the weight of whatever was happening in this moment. I could feel my heart beating faster, could sense that we'd crossed some kind of threshold that neither of us had explicitly acknowledged, but both of us understood. When I finally looked at him, Jonah was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. There was something vulnerable in his eyes, but also something certain, like he'd made a decision and was waiting to see how I would respond. The notebook was still clutched against his chest with his free hand, but his attention was entirely focused on me, on this moment, on whatever my reaction would reveal. I realized, sitting there with his hand warm in mine, that this was the first time in months, maybe years, that I felt truly awake. Everything else, the careful planning, the measured steps toward a future I designed rather than desired, felt like sleepwalking compared to the vivid immediacy of this moment. The night air moved around us, carrying the scent of late autumn and the promise of winter, but I was warm in a way that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the recognition that something fundamental had just shifted, that whatever happened next, I would never be quite the same person I'd been just moments before. I had always prided myself on being methodical, on having systems that worked. At 21, I was the kind of person who color-coded his calendar, who kept his textbooks arranged by subject and due date, who could tell you exactly how many credits I needed to graduate and which internships would best position me for the engineering firms I'd researched with the same thoroughness most people reserve for choosing what to have for lunch. My apartment reflected this careful ordering of existence. Everything had its place. The desk where I worked through problem sets with mechanical precision, the bookshelf lined with technical manuals and course readers, the single houseplant I watered every Tuesday because the care instructions recommended twice weekly watering, and Tuesday fell conveniently between my longest class days. Even my refrigerator held items purchased according to a weekly meal plan I'd optimized for both nutrition and budget. It was a life that made sense on paper, that satisfied the expectations I'd internalized so completely I barely remembered choosing them. My parents called every Sunday at 3 o'clock, and I could reliably report progress on assignments, details about my part-time shifts at the campus gym, updates on my grade point average that confirmed I was staying on track for the future we'd all agreed was appropriate for someone with my aptitudes and work ethic. But underneath this careful architecture of achievement and planning, something had been growing hollow. I'd wake up some mornings and lie in bed staring at the ceiling, trying to remember what it felt like to want something beyond the next assignment, the next semester, the next predictable step in a sequence I'd set in motion so long ago I couldn't recall who had actually made the initial choice. The emptiness was subtle at first, easy to dismiss as stress or the natural questioning that comes with being in college. But over the months, it had deepened into something more persistent, a gnawing sense that I was living someone else's life with remarkable competence, but diminishing enthusiasm. I moved through my days like someone following a script written by a version of myself who'd known what he wanted, or at least known what he was supposed to want. Then there was Jonah. I'd been aware of him long before that midnight encounter. The way you become aware of certain people who seem to operate according to different rules than everyone else. He was a literature major, which already set him apart in my world of equations and lab reports, and students who measure their worth in grade points and internship prospects. But it wasn't just his field of study that made him distinctive. Jonah moved through campus like someone who belonged everywhere and nowhere at once. I'd see him in the library, not at the long tables where most of us set up our efficient study stations, but curled into one of the old armchairs by the windows, writing in that notebook he carried everywhere. He'd be at parties sometimes, not at the center of attention, but somehow essential to the energy of the room, the person others gravitated toward when conversations needed steering or when someone needed to feel heard. He had a way of listening that made people reveal more than they'd intended, a quality of attention that seemed to draw out the parts of themselves they usually kept hidden. I'd observe this from a distance, the way he'd lean in when someone was talking, how his responses carried weight that suggested he'd heard not just the words but the meaning underneath them. Where I planned and calculated, Jonah seemed to trust in something less tangible. He'd show up to events he hadn't RSVP'd for, join conversations he hadn't been invited into, follow threads of curiosity that led him into unexpected territory. His schedule, for what I could tell, was more suggestions than commitments, shaped by inspiration and opportunity rather than the rigid structure that governed my own days. Yet despite how different we were, or maybe because of it, something about him felt familiar. There were moments when I'd catch sight of him across the quad or in a lecture hall, and I'd feel a recognition that went deeper than simply knowing who he was. It was like glimpsing something I'd lost or forgotten, some part of myself I'd organized away in my pursuit of efficiency and achievement. After that night on the steps, after the electric moment when he'd taken my hand, I couldn't stop thinking about him. The memory played itself over and over in my mind, that simple gesture that had felt like the most significant thing that had happened to me in months. I found myself looking for him in places I'd never paid attention before, scanning the dining hall, the library, the common areas where students gathered between classes. The strange thing was how that brief encounter had shifted something fundamental in my perception. Colors seemed more vivid, conversations more layered with meaning I'd previously missed. The careful routines that had structured my days began to feel less like necessities and more like choices I was making, which meant they could be unmade, altered, abandoned in favor of something I couldn't yet name, but could definitely feel. I started noticing details I'd overlooked before. The way morning light fell across my desk, transforming my neat stacks of assignments into something almost beautiful. The rhythm of other students' conversations in the hallways, the fragments of lives being lived with more spontaneity than I'd allowed myself. The possibility that my methodical approach to everything might be protecting me from experiences I didn't even know I was missing. But with this new awareness came something unsettling. The life I'd built with such care began to feel less like an achievement and more like a limitation. My organized apartment looked sterile rather than efficient. My color-coded calendar seemed like evidence of a fear of unpredictability rather than admirable planning. The very systems I'd relied on to create stability started to feel like barriers between me and whatever that moment with Jonah had revealed. I couldn't name what was happening to me, but I could feel it. Something was shifting, some carefully maintained equilibrium was being disturbed. And while part of me wanted to restore the balance, to return to the safety of measured days and predictable outcomes, another part of me, a part one was only beginning to recognize, wanted to see where this disturbance might lead. I told myself I wouldn't go back to the steps the next night. I had an assignment due in thermodynamics, a shift at the gym that would run until 9, and a dozen rational reasons to maintain the boundaries of my carefully structured evening routine. But as the hours passed, as I moved through the familiar motions of my day, I found my attention drifting toward that spot outside the dormitory, toward the memory of Jonah's voice in the darkness and the lingering sensation of his hand in mine. By 11:30, I'd abandoned any pretense of working on my problem set. The equations that usually absorbed my complete focus seemed flat and lifeless on the page, unable to compete with the pull of possibility that had taken root somewhere beneath my ribs. I closed my textbook, gathered my jacket, and walked through the quiet hallways with the kind of nervous energy I usually associated with exam days or job interviews. He was already there when I arrived, sitting in almost the exact same spot as the night before, but this time he wasn't holding his notebook. Instead, his hands rested loosely in his lap, and when he saw me approaching, something that might have been relief crossed his features. "I thought maybe you'd be here," he said simply, as if this wasn't the first time we'd planned to meet, as if there was already an understanding between us that transcended the single conversation we'd shared. I sat beside him, close enough to feel that same charge in the air, that sense of standing at the edge of something significant. The night was cooler than it had been the evening before, and I pulled my jacket tighter around myself. But the gesture felt automatic, secondary to the awareness that whatever had begun between us was continuing, evolving into something I couldn't predict or control. From that night forward, our meetings became as essential to me as any class or commitment on my calendar. But unlike those scheduled obligations, these gatherings felt alive, unpredictable in their timing and location. Sometimes Jonah would be waiting by the steps when I arrived. Other nights, I'd find him in the shadow of the library's eastern wall, or sitting on the low concrete barrier that separated the quad from the parking lot, always seeming to know that I would eventually appear. We developed an unspoken ritual of movement, never staying in one place for too long, as if the conversations needed different backdrops to fully unfold. We'd walk the empty pathways between buildings, settle on benches tucked into corners most people never noticed, find ourselves drawn to the quiet spaces where street lamps created pools of amber light in the campus darkness. Jonah asked questions I'd never been asked, questions that seemed to bypass the surface-level exchanges I was accustomed to and dive straight into territory that felt both intimate and dangerous. He wanted to know what scared me most, not in terms of academic failure or career prospects, but in the deeper sense of what kept me awake when everything else was quiet. He asked when I last cried, not from frustration or stress, but from something that had moved me beyond the reach of logical response. One night, as we sat on the steps leading up to the music building, he asked whether I believed in fate, whether I thought some meetings were inevitable rather than accidental. The question hung in the air between us, and I found myself considering not just the philosophical implications, but what it might mean in the context of us, of these midnight conversations that had become so central to my sense of what each day was building toward. I told him I'd always believed in cause and effect, in the predictable outcomes that followed from careful planning and deliberate choices. But even as I said it, I realized how inadequate that framework felt when applied to whatever was happening between us. There was something about our connection that seemed to exist outside the rational systems I'd used to organize everything else in my life. Our conversations stretched toward dawn more often than not, filled with the kind of meandering intimacy that comes when two people discover they can say anything to each other and be heard rather than judged. Jonah shared fragments of his writing, descriptions of characters he'd been observing, insights about the way people revealed themselves in unguarded moments. He talked about his complicated relationship with his father, a man who measured success in concrete achievements and couldn't understand why anyone would choose to study literature when more practical paths were available. I found myself sharing things I'd never spoken aloud, admitting that I'd built my entire life around other people's definitions of success, and somewhere along the way had lost track of what I actually wanted for myself. I told him about the growing sense that I was living with remarkable competence, but diminishing authenticity, moving through each day like someone playing a role they'd mastered but never chosen. And through all of these conversations, there was an undercurrent of something else, a physical awareness that seemed to intensify with each meeting. The way Jonah would lean closer when he was making a point, how our knees would brush when we sat side by side on narrow steps, the moments when his hand would move toward mine, as if guided by instinct before stopping just short of contact. It was as if that first touch had established a new language between us, one where proximity carried meaning and the space between our bodies felt charged with possibility. We were learning to communicate in gestures and glances, in the subtle choreography of two people discovering an attraction they weren't quite ready to name but couldn't ignore. Each night, as we parted ways and I walked back to my apartment, I carried the conversations with me like something precious and fragile. The careful order of my days began to feel like preparation for these evening encounters, everything else becoming background to the anticipation of whatever we might discover about each other when the campus grew quiet and the rest of the world felt far away. Something fundamental shifted in the way I moved through my days. Where I had once navigated campus with the focused efficiency of someone checking items off a predetermined list, I now found myself hyper-aware of every space, every corner where I might glimpse Jonah between our midnight meetings. The engineering building, which had always felt like neutral territory, became charged with possibility. The library transformed from a place of solitary study into a landscape I scanned for his distinctive silhouette curled into one of those window chairs. I began to notice things about him that I'd overlooked before our conversations began. The way he would pause at the edges of rooms, observing before deciding whether to enter fully. How his notebook was always within reach, even when he seemed completely absorbed in conversation with others. The particular quality of attention he brought to everything, as if he was constantly collecting details for stories I'd never read but somehow felt I understood. During lectures, I'd catch myself thinking about something he'd said the night before, some observation about the way people protected themselves from genuine connection, or his theory that most conversations were just elaborate ways of avoiding the things we really wanted to say. These thoughts would surface in the middle of thermodynamics problems or fluid mechanics equations, disrupting my concentration in ways that should have worried me, but instead felt like evidence that I was finally awake after years of sleepwalking. My carefully maintained routines began to feel less like necessities and more like obligations I was fulfilling for someone else's benefit. The part-time shifts at the campus gym, which had always provided a satisfying sense of physical accomplishment, now felt mechanical, my body going through familiar motions while my mind wandered to whatever topic Jonah and I might explore when the campus grew quiet. Even my apartment, with its methodical organization and purposeful emptiness, began to look different to me. The books arranged by subject and relevance seemed like props in a performance of studiousness. The single houseplant, watered with such regularity, felt like a symbol of my approach to everything, careful, controlled, designed to minimize risk rather than maximize growth. Our midnight conversations deepened with each meeting, moving beyond the tentative sharing of our first encounters into territory that felt increasingly dangerous and necessary. Jonah told me about his relationship with his father, a successful businessman who had spent Jonah's childhood trying to redirect his son's attention toward more practical pursuits. He described family dinners where his interest in literature was treated as a phase he'd eventually outgrow, conversations where his father would suggest that writing could be a hobby but should never be mistaken for a career. The pain in Jonah's voice when he talked about this disconnect was raw and immediate, but there was also something else, a fierce determination not to abandon the parts of himself that didn't fit other people's expectations. He spoke about the fear of disappearing without ever being truly known, of living a life so shaped by external approval that his authentic self never had a chance to emerge. Listening to him, I recognized something that had been growing in my own chest for months, maybe years. The sense that I had become an expert at being the person others expected me to be, so skilled at meeting those expectations that I'd forgotten to ask what I actually wanted for myself. My engineering major, my methodical approach to everything, even my carefully maintained relationship with my parents, all of it felt suddenly like elaborate camouflage hiding someone I'd never allowed myself to become. One night, sitting on a bench outside the student center while moths circled the overhead lights, I found myself telling Jonah something I'd never admitted aloud. I said that I had never truly allowed myself to want anyone, not in a way that required vulnerability and risk. I'd had relationships that made sense on paper, connections that fit neatly into my organized life without demanding anything that might disrupt my carefully maintained equilibrium. But wanting, real wanting, required a willingness to be changed by another person, to allow someone else's presence to alter the shape of your days and the trajectory of your carefully laid plans. It meant accepting that some of the most important things in life couldn't be controlled or predicted or achieved through methodical effort. As I spoke, Jonah listened with that quality of attention that made every word feel significant. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, and I could sense him considering not just what I'd said, but what it revealed about the space between us, about the careful dance we'd been performing around our growing attraction. The air between us felt charged that night, heavy with things we were learning to acknowledge but not yet ready to name directly. When he reached for my hand, not tentatively as he had that first night, but with a certainty that suggested he'd been thinking about this moment all day, I didn't hesitate. The contact felt like a confirmation of something we'd both been moving toward, an acknowledgement that these conversations had become about more than just the exchange of words. But even as I welcomed the warmth of his fingers intertwined with mine, I felt the sharp edge of fear cutting through my chest. I was beginning to understand that what I felt for Jonah wasn't something I could organize into my existing life without fundamentally altering everything I'd built. This wasn't an addition to my carefully structured existence. It was a force that threatened to reorganize everything around its gravitational pull. The realization left me both exhilarated and terrified, caught between the safety of the life I'd always known and the luminous, uncertain territory that Jonah's presence had opened before me. The revelation came on a Thursday night, in a deserted hallway between the library and the science building where fluorescent lights cast everything in harsh, institutional white. We had been walking without destination, following the familiar rhythm of movement that had become part of our midnight ritual, when Jonah stopped suddenly and turned to face the wall, pressing his back against the cold concrete. For a moment, he just stood there, and I could see something working in his expression, some internal struggle playing out in the set of his shoulders and the way his hands moved restlessly at his sides. The notebook he usually carried was tucked under his arm, but his attention was entirely focused inward, as if he was gathering courage for something he'd been preparing to say. "You don't have to be afraid of me," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying clearly in the empty corridor. The words hit me like a physical force, not because they were unexpected, but because they named something I'd been trying not to acknowledge. I laughed, but it came out nervous and strained, a sound that revealed more than I'd intended. The laughter died quickly in the sterile air, leaving us in a silence that felt weighted with everything we hadn't yet said directly. Jonah didn't move from his position against the wall. He simply looked at me with those dark eyes that seemed to see more than I was comfortable revealing, waiting for some response that would either confirm or deny what he'd observed about my careful approach to whatever was growing between us. But then, instead of words, he offered something else. He extended his hand toward me, palm up, fingers slightly curved in invitation. It was the same gesture he'd made that first night on the steps, but this time there was no hesitation in it, no testing of boundaries or tentative exploration. This was an offering made with full knowledge of what it meant, what it invited, what it acknowledged about the territory we'd been circling for weeks. The moment stretched between us, heavy with possibility and consequence. I could feel my heart beating faster, could sense that we were approaching something that would fundamentally alter whatever careful balance I'd maintained between wanting and safety. This wasn't just about holding hands anymore. This was about accepting that what I felt for Jonah had moved beyond the realm of midnight conversations and tentative touches into something that demanded acknowledgement, honesty, choice. I realized, standing there in that harsh fluorescent light, that he was right. I wasn't afraid of him at all. What terrified me was myself, the intensity of my own response to his presence, the way his voice could reshape my entire day, how the memory of his touch lingered on my skin long after we'd parted ways. I was afraid of the person I became around him, someone less controlled, more impulsive, willing to abandon carefully laid plans for the uncertain promise of whatever we might discover together. But more than that, I was afraid of wanting itself. I'd spent so many years constructing a life around other people's expectations, around goals that felt safe because they'd been validated by parents and professors and career counselors, that the experience of genuine desire felt foreign and dangerous. Wanting Jonah meant acknowledging that all my careful planning had been a way of avoiding the risk inherent in choosing something for myself, something that might not make sense to anyone else but felt essential to who I was becoming. As these realizations moved through me, I understood that Jonah had been waiting, not just in this moment, but throughout all our conversations, for me to arrive at this understanding. He'd been patient with my methodical approach to everything, including my own feelings, but there was also something expectant in his stillness, as if he knew this moment would eventually come and was prepared to accept whatever I decided. The weight of that realization was crushing and liberating at the same time. Crushing because it meant taking responsibility for what I wanted rather than defaulting to what seemed reasonable or expected. Liberating because it meant I could choose that despite all my careful planning and systematic approach to life, I was still capable of making decisions based on something deeper than logic or external approval. I looked at his outstretched hand, at the way the fluorescent light caught the lines of his palm, and the slight tremor that suggested this gesture was costing him something too. He was offering not just physical contact, but acknowledgement, admission, the kind of honesty that changes the fundamental terms of any relationship. And in that moment, I made a choice that felt both inevitable and impossibly brave. I reached out and took his hand, not briefly as we'd done before, not tentatively or with the excuse of comfort or companionship, but fully, deliberately, with the understanding that this simple gesture contained an entire confession. The contact was electric in a way that transcended the physical, a connection that seemed to run deeper than the warmth of skin against skin. It was acknowledgement of everything we'd been building toward through weeks of midnight conversations, recognition of the attraction that had been growing beneath our careful exchanges of words and ideas. But even as I welcomed the certainty of his touch, even as I felt something in my chest relax for the first time in weeks, I understood that this moment was also a threshold. There would be no going back to the careful distance we'd maintained, no pretending that what existed between us was merely friendship or intellectual connection. I was no longer the person who had sat on those cold steps weeks ago, struggling with insomnia and the growing sense that his carefully organized life was somehow missing its essential center. That person had been replaced by someone capable of wanting, someone willing to risk the security of planned outcomes for the uncertain promise of genuine connection. Standing there in that empty hallway, holding Jonah's hand with full awareness of what that gesture meant, I felt simultaneously terrified and more alive than I'd been in years. After that night in the hallway, after the electric moment when I'd taken his hand with full awareness of what that gesture meant, something shifted in the space between us. The acknowledgement we'd shared created a new kind of tension, one that vibrated with possibility and uncertainty in equal measure. We had crossed a threshold, but what lay beyond it remained undefined, waiting for decisions neither of us seemed quite ready to make. In the days that followed, I found myself caught in a strange liminal state, suspended between the life I'd always known and something I couldn't yet name, but could feel pulling at me with increasing intensity. My carefully structured routines continued, classes, assignments, shifts at the gym, but they felt like performances now, actions I completed while my real attention remained focused on whatever was building between Jonah and me. The fear I'd recognized that night didn't disappear with my moment of clarity. Instead, it evolved, becoming more specific and therefore more potent. This wasn't the abstract anxiety of change or the general unease of stepping outside my comfort zone. This was the particular terror of wanting something so much that losing it would fundamentally alter who I was, of allowing another person's presence to become so essential that their absence would leave me unrecognizable to myself. I began to understand why I'd spent so many years constructing barriers around genuine feeling. Wanting Jonah meant accepting that my careful systems of control were illusions, that the most important things in life couldn't be managed through planning or effort or methodical approach. It meant acknowledging that love, and I was beginning to understand that's what this was, despite never having experienced anything like it before, was inherently chaotic, inherently risky, inherently beyond the reach of rational management. Our midnight meetings continued, but they carried a different weight now. Every conversation felt charged with the awareness of what we'd admitted to each other. Every casual touch loaded with significance that made my breath catch in ways I was still learning to recognize. We would sit closer than before, our knees touching, our shoulders brushing, navigating the careful choreography of two people discovering the boundaries of their mutual attraction. But even as the physical space between us diminished, I could sense Jonah pulling back in other ways. Not withdrawing exactly, but creating a different kind of distance, one that felt protective rather than rejecting. He would watch me sometimes with an expression I couldn't quite read, something that looked like patience mixed with resignation, as if he was waiting for me to make a decision he'd already accepted I might not be capable of making. The weight of that unspoken expectation pressed against my chest during our conversations, making it difficult to lose myself in the easy intimacy we'd developed over the previous weeks. I could feel him giving me space to retreat, to choose the safety of distance over the uncertainty of deeper connection, and somehow that generosity made everything more complicated rather than easier. One night, sitting beneath a flickering streetlight that cast alternating patterns of brightness and shadow across our faces, Jonah finally gave voice to what had been building between us. His words came quietly, almost casually, but I could hear the careful control underneath them, the way he was managing his own vulnerability even as he offered me complete freedom. "If you let go," he whispered, barely audible above the distant hum of late-night campus life, "I won't chase you." The statement hung in the air between us, both promise and warning. He was telling me that the choice was entirely mine, that he wouldn't pressure or pursue or try to convince me of anything I wasn't ready to accept. But he was also making it clear that this was a choice, that continued ambiguity wasn't sustainable, that at some point I would need to decide whether I was willing to risk the safety of my carefully constructed life for whatever we might build together. I understood that this was his way of protecting both of us from the kind of drawn-out uncertainty that could poison whatever genuine connection we discovered. He was offering me an escape route, while simultaneously making it clear that taking it would mean losing something irreplaceable. The responsibility felt enormous. For someone who had spent years following paths laid out by other people's expectations and institutional requirements, the idea of making a choice based entirely on my own wants and fears felt almost overwhelming. This wasn't a decision I could research or optimize or approach through systematic analysis. This was about trusting something deeper than logic, about believing that what I felt for Jonah was worth the risk of fundamental change. As we sat there in the inconsistent light, I could feel the weight of everything I'd built over the past 21 years pressing against my chest. My relationship with my parents, who called every Sunday expecting reports of continued progress toward predetermined goals. My academic record, which reflected years of careful effort directed toward outcomes that had always made sense on paper. My apartment, with its methodical organization and purposeful emptiness, designed to minimize complexity and maximize control. All of it would have to be reconsidered if I chose Jonah, not because he would demand it, but because genuine love changes everything it touches. The person I would become in relationship with him wouldn't be the same person who had constructed such elaborate defenses against feeling, against wanting, against the beautiful chaos of letting another human being matter enough to alter the fundamental shape of my days. But as I sat there, feeling the warmth of his presence beside me and the cool night air moving around us, I realized that the choice had already been made, perhaps weeks ago in that first moment when he'd taken my hand. The fear remained, along with all the practical concerns about disrupting the life I'd built with such care, but underneath all of that was something stronger and more certain. I wanted this. I wanted him, not despite the risk, but because of everything it represented about finally choosing something for myself rather than accepting what others had decided was appropriate for someone with my background and aptitudes. The decision, when it came, wasn't made in words but in action, in a simple gesture of reaching for his hand and intertwining our fingers completely, holding on rather than letting go. The night we finally chose each other, we talked until the darkness began to thin at the edges, until the streetlights became unnecessary competition for the pale light that started to seep across the empty pathways of campus. We had moved from our usual spots, the steps, the benches, the shadowed alcoves between buildings, to a stretch of grass behind the library where no one would think to look for us, where the world felt reduced to just the space we occupied together. I don't remember now what we talked about during those final hours before dawn. The specific words have blurred into something more essential. The sound of Jonah's voice in the darkness, the way he listened when I spoke, the comfortable silences that punctuated our conversation like breathing. What I remember more clearly is the feeling of something settling into place, the sense that after weeks of circling around what we meant to each other, we had finally arrived at a place of honest acknowledgement. My hand remained intertwined with his throughout the night, our fingers woven together with a certainty that felt both new and ancient. There was no more tentative testing of boundaries, no careful measurement of how much contact was safe or appropriate. We had moved beyond those careful negotiations into something that felt inevitable, as if this moment of connection had been waiting for us all along and we had simply needed time to become brave enough to claim it. As the hours passed and the night deepened around us, I found myself thinking about all the decisions that had led me to this moment. The methodical choices that had shaped my 21 years, the careful planning that had kept me safe but somehow separate from my own life, the growing sense of emptiness that had been building beneath my organized existence until Jonah appeared and showed me what I'd been missing. But I also thought about the choice I'd made tonight, the decision to reach for his hand with full awareness of what that gesture meant. It wasn't just about physical contact or romantic connection. It was about choosing to become someone capable of wanting, someone willing to risk the security of predetermined outcomes for the uncertain promise of genuine feeling. The transformation felt both gradual and instantaneous. Gradual because I could trace its progression through all our midnight conversations, all the moments when Jonah had asked questions that made me reconsider everything I thought I knew about myself. Instantaneous because sitting here with our hands clasped together, I could feel that I was no longer the same person who had sat on those cold steps weeks ago, struggling with insomnia and the growing sense that his carefully ordered life was somehow missing its essential center. Jonah shifted beside me, adjusting his position without releasing my hand, and I became aware that the quality of darkness around us was changing. The deep black of true night was giving way to something softer, the kind of pre-dawn grayness that meant we had been here for hours, that another night of talking had carried us to the threshold of a new day. I felt a moment of panic at the thought of having to return to the ordinary world, to classes and assignments, and all the structures that had felt increasingly artificial since our conversations began. But then I realized that those things didn't have to remain unchanged. The person who returned to his apartment this morning would carry this night with him, would approach those familiar routines with a knowledge of what it felt like to choose connection over safety. As if sensing my thoughts, Jonah squeezed my hand gently, a small gesture that somehow conveyed understanding and reassurance and promise all at once. When I looked at him, I could see that he was watching the horizon, where the first pale suggestions of sunlight were beginning to appear between the campus buildings. Neither of us spoke about what would happen next, about how we would navigate the ordinary world with this new knowledge of what existed between us. There would be time for those conversations later, time to figure out the practical implications of what we discovered tonight. For now, it was enough to sit together in the growing light, to feel the certainty of his hand in mine, to know that we had finally stopped circling around our feelings and acknowledged them fully. The dawn came slowly, as it always does, but there was something different about watching it with Jonah beside me. The familiar campus landmarks, the library, the dormitories, the pathways I'd walked countless times, looked transformed in the pale morning light, as if I was seeing them for the first time or through someone else's eyes. I realized that this was what it meant to let another person change you, to allow someone else's presence to alter not just your daily routines, but your entire way of perceiving the world. The methodical life I constructed would still be there when I returned to it, but it would no longer be sufficient. It would need to expand, to make room for spontaneity and feeling and the beautiful unpredictability of loving someone whose presence made everything else more vivid. As the light strengthened around us, I felt Jonah lean against me, his shoulder pressing against mine, his head coming to rest in the space between my shoulder and my neck. The gesture felt natural, inevitable, like something we'd been building toward through weeks of careful conversation and cautious touch. I let my own head settle against his, feeling the warmth of his hair against my cheek, breathing in the scent that I was only now allowing myself to notice and appreciate. We sat like that as the campus began to wake up around us, as the night we'd shared gave way to whatever came next, holding on to each other and the knowledge that we had finally stopped running from what we wanted. Nothing was spoken in those final moments. Nothing needed to be. The image would remain with me always. Two young men sitting on the cold grass in the growing light, exhausted but alive, holding hands as the day began, having finally chosen each other over the safety of distance and the familiar comfort of wanting nothing at all.